Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our presentation. I'm Rolanda Lester.
I'm Andrew Lanscoot, and down below is Cheryl.
Mhm. Let me start by saying we have all been through a traumatic time through the past years, and I hope everyone is doing well at this time. Hoping everyone is doing well. As you can see on our screen, our presentation will be of the history of disability and early progress to the 1700s. Okay, you can pass the screen. In my first screen here, I just wanted to share a quote from God in Genesis 1:26. Let us make men in our image. With that being said, no one really knew what the image God was portraying at that time. So I'm going to talk to you this evening about early attitudes and treatments of the disability back in the history. Early history has shaped our behavior, perspective, and treatment of those with disability of today. And that came with many layers at that time, even from biblical days. You know, the people would outcasted and they were considered to be demon possessed. The first recorded reference to mentally disability was 1552 BC. During that time, disabled people were seen as having lower value and quality. The Roman and Greek cultures focused on humans being physically and mentally whole as citizens. So when infants was born back then, um, the disabled, they got rid of the babies routinely. They either killed them or they abandoned them. And therefore, the communities were left to take care, or the poor, poor churches or the missionaries were left to take care of these infants. Also, the Greeks back then, if uh, they were able to live through their disability, they were permitted, um, they took them in and they became beggars on the street. And the wealthy Romans took them in, but they used them for amusement at that time. And institutions became involved, and Cheryl will be discussing that with you at this time.
Yes, this is Cheryl. So in the early 1700s, in England, they were called almshouses, and the Queen decided to take in. She decided that the government was responsible for any who were outcasts, were disabled, they were sick, they were poor, the aged, and they were all placed in one big institution, one big housing unit. Uh, and because they were possessed by demons, thought to be, as Ro just mentioned, people weren't sure how to treat them. Obviously, they were people. They were they, and so these shelters provided at least a safe income for them, and they were based on charities. Uh, because of this, there was a schism in the government, not the government, but with the church, the Catholic Church, because they couldn't decide if these people were saints or sinners, and that they were sick because of their own fault. So this caused the church to become weak, and so the charities kind of closed up, and so the almshouses kind of dissolved. Here in America, at the same time, there were institutions that were again called almshouses or county homes, which we kind of have a remnant of this now in our day. They were taking in the same type of people And they were also to include homeless, abandoned children, prisoners, petty thieves, prisoners, prostitutes, and any who were poor and maimed or disabled physically and or mentally. There is a quote by Harriet Martineau. She says, "In pauper asylums, we see chains and straight waistcoats. 3 and 4 half-naked creatures thrust in the chamber, filled with straw to exasperate each other with the clamor and attempts at violence, or else gibbering in idleness or moping in solitude."
And so that brings us to early etiology and terminology. So the terminology was pretty limited in the 1700s, and it really was much more broad than what we have today, where we have very specific names and diagnoses for a wide range of conditions. So people with a pretty wide range of mental disorders were often classified as insane because of their atypical behaviors and lack of explanation for those behaviors at the time. That's the label that they were given, which wasn't very fair or necessarily appropriate by our standards today. But, you know, with the lack of medical care and medical knowledge of the time, they didn't really know what else to call the people with these, you know, mental disorders, and they didn't know exactly how to help them either. So other terms included lame, dumb, idiot, and blind. And a lot of these terms were often being used in conjunction with each other. For example, you may have heard the phrase deaf, dumb, and blind. That isn't necessarily used as much anymore. It's considered fairly offensive. But that is, you know, those are some of the terms that were used at the time. A majority of these individuals, as well as the people with physical disabilities, became wards of the state. So they were the responsibility of the state because their families could not take care of them. In the 1700s, there weren't very many people who had money to handle, you know, the expenses and extra care that came with having a family member with disabilities. So they were committed to the poor farms and almshouses that we touched on earlier to be given housing and hard labor jobs. These were not nice places. So the early etiology or causes of the disabilities for what was diagnosable was influenced by the study of eugenics, which is kind of the idea that you can control human DNA by breeding out certain undesirable traits or characteristics. It's a very controversial science and mostly decried now by modern science. No one really follows eugenics. It's pretty morally corrupt. So that behavior that was classified as mania or highly disturbing at the time was treated using forced sterilization, so not allowing these people to have kids, or lobotomies, where they severed the corpus callosum of the brain, separating the left and right hemispheres from communicating. Very brutal surgery with a lot of serious, long-lasting ramifications, or just ending up killing the people. In the 1700s in England, a lot of the anecdotal data we have comes from England during that time. Many disabled people without access to care from family, they became beggars on the street, and this was due to the harsh living conditions and the lack of care. So many developed physical disabilities or became immobile. Even if they didn't have those disabilities to begin with, they ended up, you know, developing those because of the condition at the time. So a lot of these people had a hard time getting around or moving around, so they kind of jerry-rigged some makeshift early types of wheelchairs and mobility, you know, services to get themselves from point A to point B. And so some derogatory names were given to these people that included billies and bulls, sledge beggars, and go-karts. But that didn't last because Enlightenment thinkers such as Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, they influenced the early shift to a more holistic view of people with disabilities. Locke, in particular, he posited that the mind was a tabula rasa, or a blank slate to be written on and molded. So this idea built upon the possibility that through experience and teaching, that the capacities of people with disabilities could be expanded upon and developed, and their conditions could be helped. And they could be integrated into meaningful places in society instead of just cast off to the side. This was a pretty revolutionary thought at the time. Most people didn't think this deeply about people with these afflictions. they kind of just cast them to the dustbin of society, and it wasn't, you know, appropriate or fair to those people. They needed help, and these were some of the earliest thinkers that thought maybe we can actually do something to help these people. So this later influenced many different diagnoses and approaches to care for disabled people because of these early paradigms of thought that focused more on the mental capacity and ability to grow and learn versus the affliction in its current state. So with that, if you have any questions, that's kind of just a brief overview of the 1700s, disabilities, where people went, how they lived, how they were classified, and some early names for them. So if you have any questions, feel free to comment below our video in our forum. And then these are our works cited. So thank you very much for listening to our presentation. Hope that you learned something or found it interesting. Thank you.